can start, and I'm now officially starting the session. Okay, good evening, everyone. This is Victorian Vanguard, and this will going to be the 22nd episode of Victorian Vanguard. And today we have Dr. Christian Wilkins. Dr. Christian Wilkins is a research associate and lecturer at University of Koblenz and a lecturer at the University of Düsseldorf, which is in Germany. And he has specialization in weird fiction, Gothic, and postmodernism. Christian is involved in the DFG-funded Traveling Bodies Network, exploring themes related to corporeality in traveling literature. Additionally, he is a member of Hauntology and Spectrality Research Network led by Professor Robert Edgard at York St. John's University. His interdisciplinary and transcultural research is supported by a PhD in Anglophone studies and degrees in comparative literature and Japanese studies. His monograph, Reading Lovecraft in the Anthropocene, is published by Routledge, and you can also see a video on our channel for that matter. So, over to you, Dr. Christian Wilkins, and thank you so much for joining us today.
I might like to add that today's topic is a labyrinthine thread of history, arcane knowledge, and spectral realism in Middlemarch. So over to you, Dr. Wilkins.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It's an honor to see so many people show up. I have a thought experiment today on, as has just been introduced, the novel Middlemarch by George Eliot. Ritam, could you bring up the presentation?
Yes, I'm doing that.
Perfect. Thank you.
Hopefully, it's visible.
So, yeah, perfect. If we could go to presentation mode. That's possible. So the slideshow.
Slideshow, can you put on the slideshow?
Okay, slideshow. Yes, sure.
Enable editing. Enable editing.
I think so.
How to do that?
Enable editing and then start slideshow.
It's the option of slideshowing. I am in slideshow. Okay, now it's okay.
It's not visible.
It's not visible.
No.
Give me a second. I don't know.
No problem.
No, I will be able to fix it. Hopefully. I don't know why, but my phone is lagging. My laptop is lagging right now. Will it be possible if I show it?
Can you send the PPT over to me?
Yeah, you can send
Absolutely.
it. Yes, sure. Sorry for the trouble. I mean,
Yeah, sorry everyone. Pretty much the same thing happened with me. So we thought we had it running with Ritam.
yes, I'm sending it to Indra and
Perfect.
yes.
Thank
It will
you.
hardly take a few more minutes. Hopefully, by then we will be able to
Bear
resolve
with
that.
us, just takes a couple of minutes.
Exactly.
I can also start with my script, with my presentation, and you can just catch up when you're there.
Yes, definitely. That should work perfectly.
Perfect, thank you. So, my talk is called A Labyrinthine Thread of History, Arcane Knowledge, and Spectral Realism in Middlemarch. George Eliot's Middlemarch, a study of provincial life, published in 1871/1872, is set in the fictional Midlands town of Middlemarch around the time of the 1832 Reform Bill, and traces the interwoven lives of its inhabitants. At its heart are Dorothea Brooke, an idealistic young woman yearning for a life of purpose. Edward Casaubon, the elderly scholar she marries, whose life's work, the key to all mythologies, is both monumental and hopelessly outdated. and Tertius Lydgate, an ambitious young doctor determined to reform medical science through anatomy and empirical method. Dorothea's marriage to Casaubon proves disastrous, as she discovers his sterility and his project's futility. Yet even after his death, his ghostly codicil continues to shape her choices. That would be the second slide. Thank you very much. Lydgate, meanwhile, finds his scientific hopes undone by debt, provincial suspicion, and an ill-suited marriage to Rosamond Vincy. Around these figures, Eliot weaves the larger social and political web of Middlemarch, showing how ambition, knowledge, and reform are entangled in both aspiration and failure. So the thing is, Middlemarch is seen as the great novel of reform, as I have established. It covers the reform bill, advances in medical practice, the web of provincial society as a living organism. In Ian Watt's terms, it is the novel fulfilling its role as the genre of modern realism, concrete, empirical, attuned to the everyday. Eliot herself famously described her work as, quote, a study of provincial life. When we call Middlemarch the great realist novel, we are echoing a long tradition of critical reception that elevated it to canonical status. Does the presentation work? Yes, then we're somewhere around the fifth slide, if that works. Otherwise, never mind. Henry James called the book a treasure house of details, though he doubted its artistic unity. Ian Watt, in The Rise of the Novel, positioned it as the culmination of realism's genealogy. F.R. Leavis simply declared it, quote, the greatest English novel. George Levine described Eliot's prose as the literary embodiment of the Victorian search for truth. Gillian Beer traced how it absorbed the metaphors of contemporary science. This genealogy presents Middlemarch as the novel of secular modernity, almost a scripture of disenchantment, a text that grounds meaning in the everyday, without recourse to theology or myth. But what I want to suggest by reading the novel against the grain is that this is only half the story. Eliot's details are not simply empirical, but they are also tangibly haunted. Her realism in Middlemarch does not so much banish the ghosts of older symbolic systems as weave them into the texture of the present, both diegetically and symbolically. If James admired the treasure house of details, we might say that the treasures it contains are not only rational observations, but fragments of older, arcane cosmologies that refuse to disappear. Disenchantment hovers in the pastoral skies of its rural community. The idea that modernity is characterized by the rationalization of the world, by calculability, by the fading of the sacred. Next slide, please. And certainly, Middlemarch gives us doctors, reformers, scientists, politicians. In other words, it gives us the rise of secular professionalism, underscoring the transition from earlier cosmologies to the taxonomical catalogue of various sciences. When Weber writes that modernity is marked by, quote, the disenchantment of the world, he imagines a cosmos increasingly rational, calculable, and emptied of the sacred. Lydgate, the doctor, with his medical empiricism, the reformers debating politics, the rational administrators of provincial life, these all take center stage throughout the main parts of Eliot's personal and national analepsis into memory and history. Max Weber's concept of disenchantment, in German Entzauberung, crystallizes the modern sense of living in a world stripped of mystery. As he put it in Science as a Vocation at the beginning of the 20th century, when the endeavor sketched out in Eliot's Victorian novel had arguably fully been commensurated, quote, the fate of our times is characterized by rationalization and intellectualization, and above all, by the disenchantment of the world. But Weber also admitted that this rationalized world comes at a cost. It leaves individuals grasping for meaning, haunted by what has been lost. This is precisely what Charles Taylor takes up in A Secular Age. Taylor reframes disenchantment not as the simple vanishing of belief, but as its transformation into what he calls fragile conditions, As he writes, we live in a secular age not because belief has disappeared, but because belief and unbelief coexist in new conditions of fragility. If we approach Eliot through this lens, Middlemarch becomes a bridge into secular modernity. Belief has not vanished, but it is unsettled, redirected, fragile. Dorothea exemplifies this condition. Yes, we are lagging just a bit behind on the slides. Do they work now?
Uh,
So we are somewhere around slide number 7 now, if that works. If not, then no. Yeah, so that's perfect, thank you. She is both devout and impatient with conventional piety. And the next slide, please, number 8. Her religiosity is ardent, but it strains toward a vision beyond doctrinal bounds. As Eliot tells us at the very beginning, with all her eagerness to know the truths of life, she was impatient of its petty cares, eager for some lofty conception of the world, which might frankly include her own destiny. This is devotion in a secular key, a yearning for moral seriousness and transcendent purpose, but without a stable theological ground. And it is what makes her, at least at times, so susceptible to Casaubon's key to all mythologies, not because she believes in its theology, but perhaps because she longs for a system of meaning vast enough to contain her destiny. Casaubon thus offers spiritual guidance instead of physical companionship, a promise of intellectual and moral enlargement rather than affection. What Dorothea initially sees in him is not the man himself, but the possibility that his key to all mythologies might provide the kind of encompassing framework she yearns for. The narrator notes that here was a man whose learning almost amounted to a proof of whatever he believed. For Dorothea, this aura of authority is intoxicating. Casaubon's dry and lifeless presence is transfigured into a potential gateway to transcendence. Next slide, please. Yet, what she discovers, of course, is sterility. His supposed key is not a living cosmology, but a mausoleum of fragments, already obsolete. The project's failure mirrors the fragility that Taylor describes. The desire for coherence and spiritual seriousness persists, but the resources to sustain it are no longer available. Dorothea's longing collides with Casaubon's ruinous antiquarianism, leaving her trapped between religious fervor and modern disenchantment. This tension is precisely what makes Middlemarch such a rich novel for thinking about secular modernity. It stages, in the most intimate of terms, the collapse of old cosmologies and the fragility of the new. This is a crucial lens for Middlemarch. Casaubon is not simply a relic from the past, but a man caught in that fragile space where older systems of belief no longer command assent, yet refuse to fully vanish. His project belongs to an order of knowledge already obsolete, but it continues to exert a powerful pull. But at the same time, Middlemarch is not only about individuals, but about a whole provincial community poised on the threshold of reform. The novel's setting in the late 1820s, just before the 1832 Reform Act, is crucial. That act redistributed parliamentary representation, reducing the dominance of the landed gentry and old, quote-unquote, rotten boroughs, while granting new influence to towns and the emerging professional classes. Eliot, writing 40 years later in the 1870s, looks back on this earlier world with the double perspective of personal memory and historical distance. The pre-reform Midlands of her childhood are refracted into Middlemarch, a society that is both remembered with intimacy and dissected with historical scrutiny. This double vision underscores that Middlemarch is not simply historical fiction, but an act of remembrance. It is a portrait of a rural community whose coherence is about to be shattered. Next slide, please. The rural community Eliot depicts is socially coherent yet fragile, constructed from threads of landholding, clerical authority, patronage, and reputation. Reform threatens to unsettle these patterns, introducing new actors, merchants, doctors, and reformist politicians, in the case of Middlemarch, who form the higher middle class that will eventually dominate Victorian society. This is something that we can see in our mutual friend by Charles Dickens, for example, around the same time, so the late 1860s. The web of Middlemarch is not static. It is a structure under pressure and already haunted by dissolution. Next slide, please. Casaubon and Lydgate must be read against this backdrop. Casaubon clings to a cosmology already obsolete. Lydgate, the doctor, seeks to bring scientific reform into a society unprepared to accommodate it. Both are undone not only by personal flaws, respectively, but by the spectral forces of a community itself on the verge of transformation. Reform in Eliot's hands becomes both a national turning point and a personal one. A reminder that history is not just linear progress, but a web of loss, memory, and haunting. Next slide, please. Eliot's world is not one of pure disenchantment, but of fragile coexistence, so hybridization in a way, where the sacred lingers as a spectral trace within the secular. To demonstrate via Casaubon, he is, next slide please, sorry. He is in many ways one of George Eliot's most famous failures, a dried out scholar laboring over the key to all mythologies, a project so vast, so hopelessly outdated, that it's already obsolete before he's written it. He himself laments the fact that German philology has made his approach redundant and painfully emphasizes its functional shortcomings. To many readers, he's comic, even grotesque, yet I want to suggest he's something more. Casaubon is not just a failed man, he is the figure through which Middlemarch shows us that modern realism is never free of the ghosts of the past. But at the same time, there's an unease. His presence shows us that disenchantment is never complete. Next slide, please. Casaubon's key. So, what is Casaubon actually doing? His key to all mythologies is, at one level, an absurd project, a compendium of all symbolic systems designed to reveal their ultimate unity. We know, Eliot makes sure we know, that German philology has already overtaken him, that his sources are outdated, that his life's work is doomed. And yet the sheer ambition is striking. It gestures toward a world where knowledge was imagined as total, unified, cosmic. Next slide, please. Theology, myth, arcane lore, woven into one key. Casaubon isn't simply eccentric. He's trying to preserve a mode of thought that modernity has already made impossible. As Charles Taylor observes, the medieval cosmos was charged with meaning, a world of science where the natural and the supernatural were porous. Casaubon's dream of a universal synthesis belongs to that enchanted frame. His tragedy is that he inhabits a world in which such totality has already dissolved, leaving only fragments and ghosts. Sorry for the very long quote there, we can actually skip that. But it's a characterization of the character, Casaubon. More important is the next slide, perhaps. Yes, a secular age. So Taylor says, once again, to point up the contrast with our world, so that is the comparison between a medieval cosmology and a quote-unquote modern cosmology, we can say that in the enchanted world, charged things have a causal power which matches their incorporated meaning. The high Renaissance theory of the correspondences, which, while more an elite than a popular belief, partakes of the same enchanted logic, is full of such causal links meditated by me. This is exactly, I argue, what Casaubon is after. Why does Mercury cure venereal disease? Because this is contracted in the market, and Hermes is the god of markets. And importantly, this way of thinking is totally different from our post-Galilean, mind-centered disenchantment. So Casaubon is looking for exterior values and for exterior causal narratives that can be accumulated and connected, is what I'm trying to say. This is why I think his failure isn't just personal, it is structural. It shows us what happens when the dream of a unified cosmology meets the rationalizing conditions of modernity. This structural failure comes into focus during the Rome episode. Next slide, please. Surrounded by the ruins, is that it? And the next slide, sorry. Thank you. Surrounded by the ruins of the Eternal City, Dorothea realizes with growing horror that Casaubon cannot offer her the meaning she longs for. And the next slide, sorry if I'm rushing a bit. Instead of a guide through history's labyrinth, he appears to her as another ruin. His mind, like the manuscripts he pores over, his life's work already obsolete. The city of ghosts externalizes his own spectrality. At the same time, Dorothea is drawn to Will Ladislav, whose vitality and responsiveness stand in stark contrast to Casaubon's lifeless arcana. So she is caught between those two all of a sudden, and this permeates while she and her husband are visiting Rome, which is basically a honeymoon, a very spiritual honeymoon, which is on brand for Casaubon. The Rome episode stages the novel's central epistemic crisis, the clash between a dead cosmology, a living present, and Dorothea's yearning for something that might still transcend both. Eliot spares no effort in rendering Casaubon a figure of bodily and intellectual decay. Next slide, please. His likeness to Locke's, quote, deep eye sockets, along with other features tying him to an intellectual past, renders him spectral even before death, less an embodied presence than a figure out of a medieval or Renaissance painting, haunting the realist canvas of the novel. So what we see here is a conversation between Dorothea and her younger sister. Younger sister, much more focused on appearance, and she's kind of able to see through the personality of Casaubon at a very early stage. This spectrality becomes institutionalized in the codicil he leaves behind. Even from beyond the grave, Casaubon continues to exert control. Next slide, please. Casaubon leaves certain instructions in his will, including a codicil that Dorothea reads with a deepening sense of injury. If she were to marry Will Ladislav, so Casaubon's cousin, his cousin, once removed, she would forfeit the property he had left her, a blow to the novel's plot and to the heroine's newly awakened heart. Here Casaubon acts as a ghostly legislator. His scholarship failed to produce coherence, but his authority lingers in the form of a legal curse upon Dorothea's future, like a Gothic curse, really, if you think about it. This is precisely what Derrida identifies as the logic of the spectre. So what we see here is the moment where Dorothea recognizes that Casaubon very much has a pull over her and over her relationship with his cousin, even from beyond the grave. So she will not have that inheritance if she is to commensurate her romantic interest in Will Ladislav. Next slide, please. Derrida. The spectre is not simply a being of the past. It is the future, the promise, the threat of a coming back. It begins by coming back. So a question of repetition. A spectre is always a revenant, as Derrida tells us. And this is exactly what happens with Casaubon. Casaubon begins by coming back, binding Dorothea's choices long after he should be gone. He is less a man than a trace of unresolved power, a haunting presence inscribed into the legal and emotional fabric of the novel. Casaubon recalls another famous scholar in the 19th century fiction. Next slide, please. Victor Frankenstein. When Victor arrives at Ingolstadt, his head is still filled with medieval cosmologies. He has studied Paracelsus and Cornelius Agrippa, quote, those men so full of genius whose names resounded in all the schools of science. But his professors treat these authorities with contempt. Victor recalls, every instant that you have wasted on those books is utterly and entirely lost. You have burdened your memory with exploded systems and useless names. Good God, in what desert land have you lived where no one was kind enough to inform you that these fancies, which you have so greedily imbibed, are 1,000 years old, and as musty as they are ancient? I little expected in this enlightened and scientific age to find a disciple of Albertus Magnus and Paracelsus. My dear sir, you must begin your studies entirely anew. So both of them have their arcane, more medieval-oriented worldview shattered. An interesting comparison, I think. Next slide, please. The effect is devastating. Victor, in Frankenstein, confesses that all that I had studied before appeared to be 1,000 years behind the actual state of science. The arcane systems he once revered are suddenly revealed as spectral, obsolete, but still haunting his imagination. Casaubon, by contrast, never makes Victor's leap into galvanism and experiment. His key to all mythologies resembles Victor's early notebooks, as they are grandiose, outdated, and haunted by obsolete cosmologies. But with Casaubon, instead of transforming that tension into monstrous innovation, Casaubon ossifies, paralyzed between epistemes. He becomes spectral rather than creative. Both figures, however, dramatize the same structural condition, the fragile coexistence of belief and unbelief, arcane lore and modern rationality. Eliot and Mary Shelley alike suggest that modernity is not the eradication of the old, but its haunting persistence within the new. Next slide, please. Latour argues that modernity is built on a false claim, that we have broken with the past, that we have purified reason from myth, science from superstition. In fact, Latour says, we've always lived with hybrids, with mixtures of rational and arcane, scientific and symbolic, as we can see here. The modern constitution allows the expanded proliferation of hybrids, while guaranteeing that the pure forms will not be compromised by this proliferation. Casaubon embodies precisely that hybridity. He is not outside modernity. He's a scholar, after all. He is in its midst, showing us its contradictions. It might be tempting to see Casaubon as the emblem of failed arcane knowledge, and Lydgate as the emblem of modern rational science. Lydgate, after all, is introduced as a man, quote, with a youthful belief in his power of making discoveries, end quote. His ambition is empirical, grounded in anatomy, forward-looking rather than backward-gazing. And yet, Eliot denies us that binary. Lydgate fails too. Eliot refuses to make Lydgate the simple counterweight to Casaubon. Next slide, please. If Casaubon is the ruin of obsolete cosmology, Lydgate becomes the ruin of social entanglement. His reformist medical vision collapses not through intellectual weakness, but through the suffocating grip of debt, marriage, and provincial suspicion. The Bulstrode scandal in the book crystallizes this collapse. Lydgate is dragged into disgrace by mere association, his innocence irrelevant in the face of gossip's spectral force. When he pleads with Rosamond, his wife, to sell her cherished piano to relieve their debts, she refuses, a moment Eliot renders with devastating clarity, the reformer undone, not by science, but by domestic obstinacy. Here the social web shows its spectral power. It binds Lydgate in invisible threads of money, of reputation, of conjugal disappointment. These forces are no less ghostly than Casaubon's futile mythologies. They haunt his life with an inexorable weight. By the time the narrator tells us that Lydgate, quote, always regarded himself as a failure, from the finale, we see how Eliot has staged not the triumph of modern science, but its undoing within the haunted fabric of provincial life. What this means is that Eliot does not simply juxtapose old knowledge that fails with new science that triumphs. Both fail, but for different reasons. Casaubon is undone by the impossibility of synthesis, Lydgate by the impossibility of escaping the social web. Together they reveal Eliot's vision of knowledge as always precarious. Both are haunted by forces larger than themselves. The arcane and the scientific do not resolve into a simple story of progress and decline. They intertwine as twin theories. This counterpoint is what I mean by spectral realism. Eliot's novel does not present science as triumphant and myth as defeated. Instead, it shows both projects, arcane synthesis and empirical reform, undone by the fragile, entangled condition of modernity. Realism here is not the clean march of progress, but the haunted interweaving of ambition and ruin. And next slide, please. If we shift perspective for a moment, Casaubon is not only a relic of medieval synthesis, but also a kind of proto-modern scholar. His key resembles what Bruno Latour and Steve Woolgar later describe in Laboratory Life, a relentless accumulation of notes, fragments, and references, a life consumed by inscription and classification. But unlike the scientific laboratories Latour examined, which generate authority through networks of circulation and institutional legitimacy, Kasabin's study is isolated, cut off from the community that might transform fragments into knowledge. Again, resembling Victor, I think, Victor Frankenstein. His failure then is not simply that he is outdated, but that he inhabits the spectral underside of the modern laboratory, producing endless textual traces that never cohere into living science. This sense of endless accumulation without resolution resonates with Mark Fisher's description of the eerie. Next slide, please. For Fisher, the eerie emerges in situations where there is absence of the expected presence, so what should be there but isn't, or presence without explanation, what is there but makes no causal sense. Kasabin embodies both. He labors on his key with the expectation of a grand synthesis, but the synthesis never arrives. What remains is an eerie absence, a void where meaning should be. At the same time, his intellectual authority continues to exert a presence, most chillingly through his codicil, without the explanatory power of real knowledge to sustain it. So, both as a person and as a scholar, he resembles the eerie, I argue. Seen this way, Kasabin is doubly spectral. He is the ghost of a pre-modern unity of knowledge, and at the same time he is the eerie shadow of the modern research progress, generating traces without coherence and presence without meaning. Middlemarch's realism thus becomes spectral not only because of lingering arcana, but because the very structures of modern knowledge production harbor their own ghosts. And next slide, please. The Angel of History. Walter Benjamin's vision of the Angel of History almost reads like a portrait of Kasabin. Next slide, please. His face, this is how one pictures the Angel of History. His face is turned towards the past, where we perceive a chain of events. He sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress, and I argue that Kasabin is at this very painful threshold that Benjamin here describes as well. So his mind always directed towards the past, and him being present, literally present, but in a way unable to materialize in a true teleological sense. Like Benjamin's angel, Kasabin looks backwards, seeking coherence in the ruins of mythologies. His project is less a scholarly endeavor than an act of mourning, a futile attempt to awaken the dead and make whole what has been smashed, arguably himself as well through his codicil. But the storm that drives him, the rise of comparative philology, the rationalization of knowledge, propels him inexorably forward into obsolescence. Kasabin does not resist progress, he is consumed by it, made spectral by the very forces that defy modernity. And Derrida, in Spectres of Marx, gives us the figure of the spectral, the past as something that does not simply vanish but lingers within the present unresolved. That is the beginning of what we call hauntology. Right? Next slide, please. Spin is in this sense. His project haunts the narrative even after his death. Dorothea's life is shaped by his shadow. His ruins remain. Taken together, these frames suggest that Middlemarch does not depict a clean break between old and new. It depicts a haunted continuity, a realism where ghosts of arcane knowledge still move in the fabric of modern life. Next slide, and we are on the finishing line. So, reading the spectral in the novel. Let's turn back to the text. Eliot describes Kasabin as a lifeless husk and a weak spiritual presence perpetually at danger of being extinguished by even the slightest breeze. Yet he exerts enormous power over Dorothea. He is both that and not that. already spectral. Next slide, please. The novel's great metaphor of the web is often read as realist, a network of social relations, but webs are also ghostly. We see that with the gossip, for example. Threads invisible yet binding, fragile yet inescapable. This web doesn't just capture reform and rationality, it also holds older cosmologies and unresolved fragments and the spectral remnants of arcane systems. Dorothea herself is caught in this tension. Next, I think. Yeah, next slide, please. Thank you. She longs for a life of meaning, of vision, of something larger than provincial life. Casaubon offers that in distorted form and access to the key. Her disillusionment is not just about marriage, it's about the collapse of an entire cosmology. Casaubon's ghost continues long after his death, not in a gothic spectral sense, but in a literal sense via his codicil and also via the aftermath that he imprints upon those in his vicinity. He lingers as a presence that shapes Dorothea's choices and the novel's texture. As I've noted earlier, Casaubon recalls Benjamin's angel, so facing ruins while progress drags him on. Eliot renders him tragic not because he lacks ambition, but because his ambition belongs to a world already gone. Next slide, please. Sorry, could you go back one slide? And then I'll take it over. Thank you very much. So, what then do I mean by spectral realism? It is a mode of realism that does not purify the present from the past. Instead, it allows older symbolic systems, theological fragments, arcane knowledges to persist, fragmentary, unresolved within the realist fabric, but without hierarchy really between the modern and, well, the previous cosmology. Eliot's realism is not triumphalist. It does not narrate the victory of science over superstition, of reform over arcana. Instead, it shows the haunting entanglement of the two. So, when critics like George Levine call Eliot's realism, quote, the secular search for truth, they emphasize its rational and empirical qualities. Gillian Beer has shown how deeply Eliot engaged with Victorian science, so the science of the 1860s into the 1870s, weaving its metaphors into her prose. These readings are not wrong, but they are incomplete. In the finale, Eliot writes, that element of tragedy which lies in the very fact of frequency has not been duly recognized. The growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. That's the next slide. Thank you. To read Eliot's realism as spectral is to recognize that the finale does not close with secular triumph, but again with haunted entanglement. The web Eliot gives us is never simply rational, but spectral. It binds the living to the dead, the seen to the unseen. Dorothea's final arc is not the triumph of secular rationality, but its haunting. Casaubon remains a spectral presence woven into the very web he could never master. So Eliot's realism then is not the secular clarity that James or Lewis assumed, but it is a realism frayed by ghosts, by lost cosmologies, by arcane ambitions, by spectral traces that linger. Latour would say we have never been modern. Middlemarch seems to agree. The novel's realism is haunted, not purified. Next one, please. So, to conclude, Casaubon is more than a failed scholar. He is a figure through which Eliot stages the persistence of the past in the present, the impossibility of a clean break. Middlemarch, often taken as the great realist novel, which I argue it is, of course, reveals itself as something more unsettling, a spectral realism where ghosts of myth and theology continue to flicker. If Casaubon is the most poignant emblem of spectral persistence in Middlemarch, he is not the only one. The novel persistently shows us that the past cannot be separated from the present. The lingering forms of feudalism and aristocratic hierarchy continue to exert pressure even as Eliot clearly sides with the new professional and intellectual middle class of merchants, scientists, and educators. Religious superstition lingers in provincial attitudes. Patriarchy constrains Dorothea and Rosamund alike, and also Lydgate if you think about it, because his medical ambitions, they are overthrown by the expectations that are directed towards men in a patriarchy as well, which I think is quite novel. Personal failures and mishaps are never entirely overcome. This is why Eliot ends by affirming the worth of unhistoric lives, gesturing to meaning outside official progress. Most individuals live outside the spotlight of history, their worth and remembrance often determined by forces beyond their control. Dorothea, even in the finale, is remembered with ambivalence, unkindly judged for her marriages, her life folded into the anonymous continuity of others, even though for the vast majority of the textual space of the narrative, it seems as though she is the protagonist and that her destiny will be, well, worthwhile. But here we learn that she is only met with an ambiguous reception after, well, she herself withdraws from Middlemarch. Eliot anticipates something like Latour's actor network theory. History is not the clean progress of epochs, but the ongoing entanglement of people, ideas, institutions, and objects, none of which can be cleanly separated from the past. Middlemarch realism is spectral not only because of Casaubon's ghostly project, but because the entire social fabric is woven from survivals and residues, from past forms that refuse to vanish. Next slide, please. The novel shows us history not as rupture but as network, a labyrinthine thread in which the present is always inhabited by the unresolved remains of what came before. And perhaps that is Eliot's truest realism, not a vision of certainty but of entanglement, a realism frayed by the spectral. To call this spectral realism is not just to describe Casaubon, but to name something in Eliot's narrative method, because she refuses to let the past vanish cleanly. She insists on the entanglement of myth and reform, of theology and science, of arcane dreams and modern disappointments. And perhaps this is why Middlemarch continues to speak so powerfully. It does not reassure us with stories of progress. Next slide, please. It unsettles us with the persistence of ghosts. Progress drags ruins in its wake, and the spectral remains irreducible to presence. Eliot gathers all of these into narrative form, and she leaves us with a vision of history not as linear progress, but as a labyrinthine thread, haunted, entangled, spectral. Next slide, please. Which is my heartfelt thank you to everyone who listened to this. Then you can see my bibliography on the next slide if you're interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I mean, it was a very wonderful lecture. It has so many arguments, so many new aspects that I never really thought about it, and I really enjoyed the presentation. And in fact, the presentation was also very enriching. You have used so many different philosophies and everything. It is just marvelous.
Thank you so much. It felt like a very long monologue, so sorry for that, and thank you for following along.
I think the lecture was quite rhythmous. It went like a flow. And to be very honest, like George Eliot has always been very mystical, in my opinion. I mean, she advocates this idea of religious humanism, where he kind of uh, um, enmeshes these two philosophy of science and religion together, and that is very true. So here also, like the past is very much entangled with the present. You cannot really say what is happening actually. So do you think that if this is the case, then Eliot believed in the possibility of uniting all the knowledge, like Casaubon hoped for in this novel? I mean, is it something like a replica of what she has been trying to implant over there?
I would say, based on my analysis of the novel, that she would deem this a futile approach and a futile endeavor, actually. We see this in her, as I call it, analeptical account of the 1820s in the Midlands, She sees that this previous, we could even call it pastoral community, I think that is not an exaggeration, will be overthrown by some decisions that will be made somewhere in the capital and which will have, well, just overburdening consequences for that rural community. At the same time, we see all these things that linger against that. Um, there's nothing supernatural at all in Middlemarch, but read in another way, all that I call spectral in that novel actually persists. So that is the aftermath of feudalism, for example. It is also the clerical authority and even the patriarchal structures that I've hinted at. Um, so maybe this is me with my own agenda, but I would think that Eliot is aware of the previous Renaissance, maybe even medieval cosmology, always persisting against the efforts at scientification and rationalization.
Yes, rightfully. I mean, and she was quite talented. I mean, she knew Spanish, she knew Italian, and she even wrote an epic, and we hardly know anything about that work. So maybe she attempted to create that path. Indulinda, would you like to
Maybe,
say?
and of course, when it comes to social reform, she was very innovative in her own private life, right? Having a relationship with an openly divorced man. That is the big departure from somebody like Dickens, who she, of course, was friends with. But Dickens, he entertained his love affair with Ellen Ternan in his late years away from London. So with Dickens himself, we can also see kind of the powerful pull of gossip and of public perception. But Eliot, I think, really probes the threshold of revolution and of innovation in social terms, and perhaps in Middlemarch also in scientific and in, well, hermeneutic, I would say, terms. Yeah,
Exactly.
fascinating person.
Exactly. She had a quite scandalous life. She did. She even married someone at the end of her life.
Yeah, and openly, without hiding that.
Exactly.
I think we had a raised hand. I think it was Tina Kyrie who had raised her hand to ask a question probably, and we have a question in the chat box. So, Dr. Christian, would you like to answer someone by the name of Rain? The question is, you might go to the. I thought you might go to the route of liminality, but then again, a community caught in a period of transience and poised upon change. All the factors are there. How would your analysis shift when viewed through this lens?
Fascinating question. There are certainly liminal elements and also, I would say, liminal characters. So, for example, something that Middlemarch is perpetually occupied with is how does power shift across the reform acts. The first act of reform, of course, being the focus, always in the background. It's always kind of hovering and announcing itself. And then we see how, by that act of reform, the aristocratic, feudalistic pole of upper society, the upper echelons of society, are supposed to be overthrown. But on the other hand, we also have these families who have traditions in these areas, how they plan out which directions their offspring will go into. So, for example, we have somebody who begrudgingly enters the clergy and becomes a clergyman, because this, once again, is seen as a stable continuation of that previous level of power that was experienced by that family. And one thing, when talking about the term liminality, I find it interesting to look from a 21st century perspective, particularly a 21st century British perspective, on what is happening here in the early 19th century in Middlemarch. Because arguably, and this is a bit of a political opinion perhaps as well, but arguably property ownership, feudalism have never been entirely overthrown in the case of Britain, perhaps much more in continental Europe. But this liminality, so what happens to one rural community is certainly there. We have some very liminal characters, and we have some characters who you can easily foresee they will become remnants, and then characters like Lydgate, who are certainly born too early. They are born into that feudalistic society, even though they have reform at heart, and they have very many innovative ideas, which they cannot commensurate because they are tied to these social contracts. I don't know if that answers the question. So I want to say that we can see liminality in certain spaces, both kind of physically and personified, and that is juxtaposed with the reformers, and that is also juxtaposed with the remnants of a previous world, from my perspective.
I think that's a thumbs up of like appreciation or like assurance that your answer you've answered the question. Uh, there's another question probably in the chat box. So the question reads like this, sir, I want to ask that how this text can be interpreted in context of psychoanalysis hidden inside the text. Could you please explain, sir? Like probably aspects of psychoanalysis within the context of Middlemarch.
I think you can write an entire monograph on a psychoanalytical analysis of just Middlemarch, but sticking with the characters who I have focused on, Sabin, for example, you could argue, this is me spontaneously coming up with a psychoanalytical take on the relationship between Sabin and Dorothea, so please excuse me. But of course, Dorothea, she is, as I've argued, very traditionally religious. So different from her younger sister, for example, she does not focus on physical appearance at all. But when traveling to Rome, that is the moment really where their marriage falls apart. And I do think that suddenly we have some physical, maybe even some sexual elements, which of course are not don't take center stage, but they suddenly enter into the background. All of that happens with the installation and introduction of Will Ladislav, who is this vivacious cousin of Kasavin's. So we can see that sexual desire is something that, as we expected perhaps in a proto-Victorian society, is supposed to be suppressed, right? Happens with basically all the main characters apart from some of the more minor characters. So for example, sometimes people have a sympathy for people like Lydgate, the doctor, based on his physical appearance and also on his manliness, quote unquote. On the other hand, we have somebody like Dorothea who undergoes a complete transformation, and suddenly we learn that, well, she's discovering that, well, she has a physical yearning for male companionship as well. And that is how Will Ladislav replaces the very sterile, and not just sterile, but well, also completely incapable in sexual terms, previous husband that Kasabin was. So she discovers that religious order is perhaps not enough to sustain her in one lifetime. She needs something else. She needs a romantic companionship, and perhaps something that is never made explicit, also a sexual companionship. I remember when I taught that book a few years ago that this is something that we also focused on with several of the characters, but with Dorothea it's quite pronounced, without ever becoming really explicit in the text.
Great, it's a very new perspective altogether. And I also have one observation, and that is, since Victorian age is all about skepticity and like how people are quite skeptic about the industrial revolution and the science interfering with their lives. You mentioned that people did not accept Ledgate because did not really like the idea of doctors coming in and curing others. There is this book called Poor Miss Finch by Wilkie Collins, and in that book, I think there was this doctor, and people did not really like this idea of that doctors are curing others and kind of substituting their position with the god and interfering with, like, maybe there is this idea also presented in that book.
I think so. So the problem with Lydgate is, on the one hand, of course, that he is an outsider who enters into Middlemarch with all these aspirations. He has studied in the city, but of course, he has pretty much spent all the money that he has in the city, and then suddenly he is also expected to engage in a marriage even before he is able to really um, materialize all the innovative ideas that he has. But if we just proposed a possible psychoanalytical analysis and reading of Middlemarch, then I think a Foucauldian analysis of Middlemarch that focuses on how institutions are replaced. So, for example, what is the idea? What will Lydgate replace in that rural community, and how do people respond to the authority that he, because of his sojourn in the city, because of his academic accomplishments as well, that he holds, of course. How do people respond to that? So it's always about power as well. And in a medical scenario, um, the idea that somebody has the ability, but also the permission to, well, to to examine you, and the fact that you have no secrets from them. That is something that in an early 19th century environment is quite pronounced, I think, and quite prolific. So it's interesting to read Middlemarch as a philological document that way as well. The beginnings of really empirical science and empirical medical science as we understand them today. In a way, Middlemarch tells us how the world we now inhabit came to be, minus, say, some technical innovations like the internet, television, telephone, but very much from a psychological realism standpoint, a world resembling our own. That is different in 1800, but it's not so different in 1850 and certainly not in 1890 later on in the century. And Middlemarch is at a very pronounced and productive moment in that trajectory, I think.
True. Exactly. And based on that, I guess the central question is like, can we ever really separate myth and reasons, or I might say like, can we separate past from the present, because it's always ever shifting and ever changing.
You see, I side with Bruno Latour here. His idea of, well, we have never actually been modern, and the way that we distribute knowledge, and also the way that we hierarchize knowledge, so our hierarchies of what is true and what is not true in a post-factual age, right? 21st century, particularly the 2020s. And it kind of renegotiates the value of a novel like Middlemarch as well. So that is why I tried to read that novel against the grain, and hopefully I succeeded in some ways, because I think that it does support readings that look at how authority and knowledge and empirical, epistemologies really are hierarchized.
It definitely did. I mean, it has created a new pathway, I guess. It will definitely going to change how we used to read Middlemarch from now on.
So, are there any more questions to Dr. Wilkins? I think you have like very elaborately like presented the topic, and that like really opens up a new avenue of like reading Middlemarch, as Pritam said. Like it's definitely a new avenue to read Middlemarch. So, Pritam,
Or maybe people,
yeah.
if people are interested, they can read all about that in the future at some point, right?
Exactly, exactly.
Definitely. That's that is
Congratulations.
what we are like working on. That is what we are planning on actually. So that will require some months, and eventually people will get to read the entire argument here.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
We just have another question. I'm so sorry that.
No, no.
The question is, sir, if you could interpret the text from the perspective of health humanities or medical humanities or graphic medical humanities, and your inputs on it.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to evade that question. I'm very sorry, because I'm not an expert on medical humanities. I have so many friends working in that in that vein, and I would love to ask them about that, but I would completely feel like a pretender coming up with an answer that is tailored to the medical humanities. So I'm very sorry, but I myself am interested in those questions as well. I hope you forgive me for that answer or lack of answer.
That's not a problem, and we can get to it through some other lectures, and definitely we will in the near future. So thank you, Wilkins. May I now request Rhythm to officially deliver the vote of thanks for today's session?
Okay, so thank you so much, sir. I mean, it was a very wonderful lecture, and it is, I guess, one of those videos that will completely going to change the way we used to perceive Middlemarch, because that will create a new avenue. And I really enjoyed the presentation, and not only the lecture, but the way you presented every argument with proper citations. So if someone wants to go or read more about it, they can easily find that. And again, and thank you everyone for joining the lecture. Now we are coming to an end. Hopefully we will be able to meet here again. And not only that, if you want to know more about this lecture, you will be able to do that in the future, right?
Yes, it's a point that we need to stress on. As Rhythm and Dr. Wilkins rightly pointed, that we are developing a book on this. So in the course of near future, we'll be having something more tangible, like an essay form. So all those who are interested in Dr. Wilkins' essay, they will have access to it in the near future. Thank you, everyone, and most importantly, thank you, Dr. Christian Wilkins, for coming here on Victorian Sundays. Thank you very much.
Thank you and everyone so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So good night, everyone.
It's already night.